Let me ask you something that nobody in a suit wants you to think too hard about. Every time you see a news ticker that says conflict escalating, somewhere, a stock goes up. Every time a missile is fired, someone just got paid. And I don't mean the soldier pulling the trigger. I mean the guy in the boardroom who built it, lobbied for it, and whose company donated to the exact senator who approved the budget that bought it. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is accounting. Today, we're going inside the machine, the one that turns human suffering into quarterly earnings, and we're going to follow the money. Every dollar, every contract, every handshake. Because once you see how this works, you cannot unsee it. Here's a name most people have never heard of, and that's not an accident. Smedley Butler, two-time Medal of Honor recipient, the most decorated Marine in American history at the time of his death, a man who spent 33 years fighting wars for the United States government and then spent the rest of his life trying to warn you about them. In 1935, Butler published a short, brutal, extraordinarily dangerous book called War is a Racket. Not dangerous because it was radical. Dangerous because it was specific. He didn't talk in abstractions. He named names. He ran numbers. He showed receipts. Take the Central Leather Company. Before World War I, they were pulling in around $1.2 million a year in profit. Comfortable, stable, boring. Then the war started. By 1916, their profit had exploded to $15 million in a single year. That's not growth, that's a feeding frenzy. Over 1,100% in profit because young men were dying and someone needed to supply the boots on their feet. Or look at the International Nickel Company, $4 million a year before the war. Then nickel became essential for armor plating and ammunition, and suddenly they were banking $73 million a year, a 1,700% increase. Butler's conclusion was savage and simple. A few people made enormous fortunes. The rest of us paid for it, in taxes and in blood. Now here's the part that should genuinely disturb you. That book was published in 1935. It sold millions of copies. It was quoted in Congress. And then almost nothing changed. In fact, it got bigger. Jump forward 26 years. January 17, 1961. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a five-star general, a man who commanded the Allied forces on D-Day, a man who built the American military apparatus, is giving his farewell address to the nation. And he says something that no sitting president had ever said out loud. We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. Read that again slowly. The outgoing President of the United States, himself a career military man, is standing at the podium, on his way out the door, warning the country about its own military machine. Why did he wait until he was leaving? That question alone should tell you something. What Eisenhower was describing was not an army, it was an ecosystem, a quiet, self-reinforcing loop that had wired itself into every layer of American political and economic life. Defense companies need contracts to survive. Contracts require wars, threats, or the perception of threats. Perception is shaped by media, think tanks, and political rhetoric. Politicians need campaign money. Defense companies have campaign money, and so the wheel turns. But let's be precise about the mechanic, because this isn't vague, this is operational. When a government goes to war, it cannot fight with just soldiers. It needs equipment, logistics, fuel, food, communications, reconstruction. And governments don't manufacture any of that themselves. They outsource it, at scale, on guaranteed contracts, often with profit margins written into the agreement. Not earned, guaranteed. The New Yorker reported that between 2007 and 2014, the U.S. spent $89 billion on contracting in Afghanistan alone. One logistics company, the Watan Group, grew from $500,000 in revenue to $58 million in 18 months. Not because they were exceptional, because a war started near them. This isn't a free market. This is a government-backed gold rush. Wars are extraordinarily expensive. No country simply has that money lying around. So governments borrow. They issue bonds. They take loans. And someone has to hold that debt, which means someone is collecting interest on every bullet fired, every bomb dropped, every mile of logistics managed. During both World Wars, American and European banking houses made fortunes arranging war financing. The bigger the war, the bigger the loan. The longer the war, the longer the interest compounds. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Some of the most powerful financial institutions in history grew their wealth during periods of maximum human catastrophe. And their incentive structure, if you follow it honestly, does not always point toward peace. Now, this next one people wave off as a conspiracy theory, but it keeps proving itself. Wars are rarely just about ideology. They're about geography, resources, access. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow passage of water between Iran and Oman, handles 21 million barrels of oil and petroleum every single day. Japan, South Korea, and most of Europe depend on it for 30 to 50% of their energy imports. Now ask yourself, Why has U.S. foreign policy toward Iran been aggressive and uncompromising for decades, even when diplomatic openings existed? Or consider Iraq in 2003. When American forces entered Baghdad, much of the city was left to chaos. Public buildings burned, museums were looted, infrastructure collapsed. But multiple journalists on the ground reported the same anomaly. U.S. forces maintained a tight, sustained perimeter around the Ministry of Oil. Not the hospitals, not the power grid, the oil ministry. We're not saying there was a smoking gun order from the top. We're saying, follow what was protected, and you'll understand what was valued. Wars also need stories. No government can sustain a long, expensive military campaign without public support. And public support doesn't happen organically. It's manufactured. This is where propaganda meets profit. Because the media companies that amplify war narratives, that frame conflicts as moral crusades for freedom and democracy, often operate within a web of financial incentives. Defense advertising revenue, government contracts, tax arrangements, regulatory favors. Since the internet fractured the old media monopoly, this has gotten harder to execute cleanly. People can now cross-reference claims in real time. Alternative narratives spread faster than ever. But don't mistake harder for gone. The architecture is still there. It's just adapted. Now here's the mechanism that almost nobody talks about. And once you understand it, a lot of modern foreign policy starts making a different kind of sense. Military equipment has a shelf life, not because it stops working, but because technology moves. Weapon systems from 10 years ago are already approaching obsolescence. The rapid emergence of drones, AI targeting, and autonomous systems has accelerated this dramatically. So what do you do with a warehouse full of artillery, tanks, and missiles that are outdated by Pentagon standards, but still lethal by any normal measure? You send them somewhere that needs them. Ukraine receives older American weapon systems from existing stockpiles. That creates a gap in U.S. military inventory. That gap triggers a government contract to replace the equipment with newer, more advanced gear. The defense company gets the contract. The Pentagon upgrades its arsenal. And America can frame the whole transaction as humanitarian aid. Meanwhile, U.S. allies who donated their own weapon systems to Ukraine often turn around and purchase fresh American replacements. The math works out beautifully for everyone except the people in the actual war zone. According to one analysis, roughly half of all U.S. military aid to Ukraine flowed back into contracts with American defense firms. And between 2020 and 2024, U.S. arms manufacturers secured nearly $2.4 trillion in Pentagon contracts, with a third of that going to just 5 companies. 5 companies. Now here's where it gets personal. Because this system doesn't sustain itself through shadowy backroom deals. It sustains itself through something far more banal and far more legal. Career incentives. A 4-star general retires after 30 years of service. He has deep relationships inside the Pentagon. He understands procurement processes, acquisition timelines, and exactly which bureaucratic doors lead to billion-dollar contracts. Within 18 months, he's on the board of a major defense contractor. He's not there because of his military strategy. He's there because of his Rolodex. That general then appears on cable news with his impressive credentials listed beneath his name, urging a robust response to whatever international crisis is currently on screen. He doesn't disclose that the company paying him makes the missiles he's advocating for. This is legal. This happens constantly, and it works. Because when a decorated general says the country needs to escalate, it doesn't sound like a sales pitch. It sounds like patriotism. Think tanks funded by defense contractors publish threat assessments that consistently find more threats, reports that emphasize danger, recommend intervention, and provide the intellectual scaffolding that politicians need to justify defense budgets to their constituents. And those politicians, particularly those whose districts contain weapons factories and military bases, have a direct financial incentive to keep the machine running. Not because they're evil, because if the factory closes, their constituents lose jobs, and they lose their seat. The system doesn't need villains. It runs on incentive alignment. Now here's where we have to resist the pull toward a simple, satisfying narrative. Because the easy version of this story ends with, the military-industrial complex is pure evil. War is manufactured by greedy men in suits. And if we just dismantled it all, the world would be peaceful. That's not true. And pretending it is doesn't help anyone. The world is competitive. Nation-states operate in an environment without a true global enforcer. Power vacuums get filled, not always by the most benevolent actors. History is full of examples of what happens when a society dismantles its military capability in an environment where others haven't. Military technology does need continuous investment. The gap between cutting edge and outdated can be life or death at scale. Deterrence is real. The reason World War III hasn't happened isn't just luck. It's because certain powers understand the cost of starting it. So the defense industry isn't purely parasitic. It performs a genuine function. But the question isn't whether we need a defense industry. The question is, who decides when it gets used? And are those decisions being made based on national security or on the financial interests of the people making them? That's the tension. And it's a real one. Eisenhower didn't say, abolish the military. He said, guard against unwarranted influence. He was drawing a line between necessary defense and institutional self-interest. And his warning was that the line would be very, very hard to hold because the people on the wrong side of it have every incentive to blur it. Here's what I want you to take away from this. Next time you see a news cycle building toward military conflict, pay attention to who's talking. Check their affiliations. Follow their funding. Ask what they stand to gain if the answer to the crisis is more weapons, more deployment, more war. Not because everyone advocating for military action is corrupt, but because the system is structured so that the voices with the loudest platforms and the most impressive credentials often have the most to gain from a particular outcome. Smedley Butler figured this out in 1935. Eisenhower tried to tell us in 1961. The machine is bigger now, more sophisticated, better funded, better at hiding in plain sight. The least we can do is understand how it works. If this made you think differently about something, share it. The algorithm doesn't love this kind of content, but people do. See you in the next one.